Well, first of all, since we are introducing a new person here, I would like for Anders Bjartnes, welcome, to get a couple of minutes to establish yourself in a way. So you are the general manager and the editor-in-chief of Energi og Klima, which is translated as Energy and Climate, quite easy, which is the web-based news service of the Norwegian Climate Foundation. And prior to that, well, you've been there for a couple of years now, several years. You worked for approximately 25 years in mainstream media as a reporter. And with that experience and background, how do you see the role of media? Because I would like us to reflect a little bit upon the role of the media in the transition. And to what extent would you say that this role has changed, if it has, during the last few years?
Well, if you look at the media coverage of climate change and the energy transition in the media, my view is that there has been a significant change over the last years in a positive direction. And the reason why is that climate change and the energy transition have moved into the core of what politics and business is about. Big money, big decision, how do we form our societies for the future? And when politics and business move, so does journalism. So if you look at, for example, the BBC or our own NRK, they are doing a lot of good journalism on climate change and the energy transition. Explaining what's at stake, describing what's going on, often combining facts with creative and compelling storytelling, being David Attenborough or visual stories designed for digital representation. And my favorite paper would be the Financial Times. That's the world's best newspaper. They introduced a climate section in the paper and on their website a couple of years ago, giving the coverage a very prominent position, often in combination with stories about how companies and markets and politics are affected. So they're daily producing high-quality journalism on the transition and covering nearly any aspect or perspective you could think of. And that means, okay, there's a lot of good information, high-quality journalism out there if you are looking for it.
But not only.
And of course, there's a lot of stupidities and bad journalism also, and free journalism is under pressure in many parts of the world, but I think it's wrong and oversimplified to frame the role of media in the way as it is done in the framing of this introduction of this session.
Yeah, because you were reacting to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's very American. Media seems forced to compete for attention by polarizing, focusing on personalities before situations, exaggerating and using other distortion tools to succeed in an information-rich society. I don't think that's true.
You were a bit provoked by that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a former journalist as well, so I was thinking, yeah, okay. I'm not sure. But then again, when the debates harden regarding, for instance, in our own backyard, onshore wind, energy prices, biodiversity issues versus energy security, etc., the media is prompt to strengthen the polarization of the debates. And that is because that is actually at the core of the news criteria in many ways.
Sure.
Make conflict and let both sides speak.
Sure. But Thomas was alluding to the need to find compromise, to acknowledge conflict as something natural that we always have in society, but then try to find compromise. And I think that, and then I'm taking the editor hat on my head and saying that media is not a problem in this big transition. Media, based on the values and virtues that dominate journalism in the Western democratic tradition, is a prerequisite for the transition. And if I could quote the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Ressa, who said in Oslo before Christmas, without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without trust, we have no shared reality, no democracy, and it becomes impossible to deal with our world's existential problems, climate, coronavirus, the battle for truth. So it's our job to examine how politics and politics work, how politicians and business behave, how corporate interests are played out. But conflict is not a natural thing. We have to handle it wisely.
But is part of the conflict, and this is a question that goes to all four of you, and maybe Ed and Anders feel inclined to answer it first, but We live in a world of information, and I would say information, not necessarily communication, because we are sort of receiving a lot of information, and we need to be critical when it comes to the sources of this information. And that is something which is difficult to do if you're not conscious enough about what the sources are. And we're talking about echo chambers, we're talking about trolling. We have several platforms that we can sort of communicate on, social media, etc., etc. Doesn't that mean that we have actually parallel truths out there? But people tend to, because as you were saying, Thomas, individuals are individuals. My concept of a good society doesn't necessarily correlate with yours. So how do we solve this? I was looking at Ed. You were smiling when at a point there. How do you see that in the U.S. and also with your the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I wish it weren't the case, but truth is a matter of opinion. Trust is absolutely fundamental. So if we trust, we tend to believe what is being said is true. And maybe it's because we want to believe what is being said is true. Our former president in the US, Donald Trump, a master communicator, not because anything he said was true, but because he had a really brilliant way of taking complex issues and rendering them simple. He is the master of simple, clear messages repeated often. And because of the simplicity of his messaging, lots of other trusted voices in American society joined him to repeat his messaging, including Fox News and lots of our conservative media outlets in the US. So, you know, truth is a matter of opinion, but trust is primary. So I clearly we need to do our best to activate the trusted voices in society. And journalism, you know, looking at global polling on who is trusted, unfortunately, journalism as a profession, not nearly as trusted as it should be, not nearly as trusted as it has been in the past. Journalists and journalistic institutions have some work to do to rebuild their trust, but featuring other trusted voices in society, I think is a really good way to rebuild that trust.
Interesting that you mentioned Donald Trump, because I was thinking about fake news, which is probably one of his favorite terms that he's been using a lot. And how do we sort of get rid of that? Ed, you were talking about using trusted voices, so different voices than the journalists. Anders, what is your take on this?
Well, I think that we have to distinguish a little bit between a European opinion or landscape and an American one. We have, thank God, the NRK and the BBC type of institutions in Europe.
Broadcasting.
The broadcasters. And they are publicly financed. They have another economy than the commercial TV broadcasters that are dominating in the US, and they are setting a kind of standard for the public discussion in the society. It's super important that you have trusted. They are trusted institutions. They have very high trust in society, and they are making or they are demanding from all other media institutions that they have to keep up to a certain level of quality. And that's, I think, a very, very important thing. Even, of course, we have also bullshit media here, but not to the same extent as I can, that my view would be about the situation in America, which is different than ours.
Susan and Thomas, would you like to comment on the role of the media and the mass media in the transition?
Sure, and this stems from something Ed said. I think it's important to recognize that people are not just looking for the truth when they read the newspaper. They're looking for, in many cases, affirmation that they already know the truth. They want to be confirmed. And they are also looking to have their identities affirmed. So if they affiliate with a particular political party, they'll be looking for information that tells them they're in the right group. So I think everybody knows at a personal level that people are irrational, but we don't always take it into account when we think about people. I mean, it's not that you can't tell people anything, but you have to recognize there are other motives there. The other thing I want to say about the media is I agree that they've gotten much better in their coverage of climate change. 5 years ago it was all, well, here's someone who said the climate is changing. Let's hear from the other side.
Yeah.
And you don't
Which
see
was
that.
represented by barely 3%.
Exactly,
So yeah,
exactly.
they actually stopped doing that after a while.
But one thing they still do, at least in the US, is really often sensationalize the issue. And there's some evidence that that does make people more anxious. So I think there's the bad news bias among the media, and perhaps we need more stories about the possibility of transitions, I think.
I'm not sure if I remember this correctly, but I had the notion that the IPCC, when they were, I think it was for the fourth report, I believe, I think they were, at one point, they were criticized for being too gloomy and too pessimistic. So they tried a different approach at the next crossing, and precisely talking about the possibilities and the opportunities. And last year we had the code red for the planet. So Ed, you were talking about making conditions where people, I think you said politicians and corporations, where they can feel that they are having a reward and not being punished. But isn't that also clouding a bit the backdrop, which is pretty serious? We've been talking all day about how this is, we need a speedy transition. We can't linger anymore. We need to speed things up. And then shouldn't people be aware that the backdrop is pretty serious? How do you reward people for not doing things in the right tempo? And this is, well, Ed first maybe, but I guess everyone would like to comment on that.
Yeah, our research has shown that there are really only 5 what I call key truths about climate change that people need to understand in order to feel the need to get involved, rethink what their actions, the implications of their actions. Those 5 key truths can be expressed in 10 words. It's real. Global warming is real. It's us. It's human caused. Experts agree. We've just talked about that. The fact that now it's not 97%, it's 99.9% of the world's climate scientists are convinced of human-caused climate change based on the evidence, that it's bad, that climate change is harming us in important ways, which is the impacts part that you were talking about, Ruth. And then finally, that there's hope. There are actions we can take that will make this situation better. Our research has shown that if you only deliver it's bad part, it tends to be deflating, demotivating. But if you only deliver there's hope component, I would say that it's irresponsible, that we are not acknowledging some fundamental truths about the situation that must be kept first and foremost, because we've got some serious work to do. But our research has shown that when your messaging acknowledges the ways in which it's bad, acknowledges the reasons for hope, that there are actions that we can take that will make a profound difference, and invokes, as Susan was suggesting, it invokes a social norm, that there are a growing number of people in society who are now getting involved to put in place the actions that are necessary, that it motivates people, it draws them in, they feel invited in to consider what role they can play. So yeah, the truth is complicated, but not so complicated, and we've learned that it's bad, there's hope, and there's a growing social norm to take action. Those are 3 incredibly helpful elements of an engaging message.
You see this in your research?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things to reflect on in that respect. So, on the one hand, it's a message about climate change and the kind of urgency, and there's also growing literature which is actually skeptical. It seems to be my role to be the skeptical critic, but which kind of flags we call deadlineism as a kind of challenge. And of course, Code Red, I don't remember how many years it was last time, but we have had these deadlines, frequently over the last 20, 30 years probably. And that is also a repeated message, which I think isn't necessarily something that sparks action. And then I think this point that was made here, okay, it's real, but then sort of you can focus on these different elements in yourself and in society more broadly. So there's kind of different elements of this message about climate and transitions. It's not one, it's multiple messages.
You're very polite, so you just show me a finger if you want to comment. Susan?
Yeah, I think also that and I know Ed would agree with this, there are multiple audiences, and so the message may need to be different for the different audiences. If people aren't scared enough, they really need perhaps to be given a greater sense of urgency. But if they're already very scared, they need to be given more hope. And I think the idea of an inspiring alternative, most people would agree that the world could be better. They may disagree about in what way it could be better, but giving them an inspiring vision of a transition, something we could be working towards, and giving them room to imagine their own role in that, I think can really inspire action.
To pick up one thing here, and that's one thing I'm getting more and more sure of, working with these issues, climate and energy issues over the years, and that's the need to focus on the distribution of benefits and costs related to the transition. Because if you look at what's going on in Europe now, with these extremely high energy prices, costing ordinary people a lot to heat their house, to drive their car, and if we're not able to address this and to make sure that the least affluent part of the population is taken care of in this transition, it will stop. And this is, I think, very important that we both in journalism, of course, and when policies are developed, that we really look into how the policies which we need to speed up the transition are addressing these issues related to distribution between groups, regions, classes.
And politics is extremely important in this, and the title for this session was People, Polarisation and Populism. And I guess we've seen a growth of populism for the last few years, which could be seen as counterproductive when it comes to the transition, the necessary transition. There are some questions that I would like, of course, I should actually invite the front row. Sorry, I didn't forget about you, but Stephen Gabriel, I know that you have a challenge maybe for the panel?
Observation.
Yeah.
Observation question.
Yeah.
So I kind of see the COVID pandemic as a dress rehearsal for climate change, because it's a collective experience in both cases. People didn't have to participate, but what worked, what didn't work, if we can make that analogy. So I want to say a little bit more, and then I want to ask the panel for their opinion. So two cases that I read, I didn't experience this, but Denmark early on paid people 70% of their, I think if I'm correct, 70% of their salary to stay home for 3 weeks. So it's kind of like a pandemic feed-in tariff. You stay home, it helps things out, right? And then maybe people would have that continuity with, doing the right thing. Portugal had issues with vaccination, and then they had a military guy who took over and said, this is not a war between you, rival parties. This is a war against the pandemic. So in both cases, the government needed to step in initially to get the ball rolling, and then the right carrots and sticks, to make things better. We're not out of the pandemic yet, but these are positive steps. How much of that translates to this climate change, which is more amorphous, it's not immediate, you don't have a family member dying or whatever, but we ramped up pretty quickly with all the vaccinations and the vaccines, which was government supported in a lot of cases. So some discussion on that would be appreciated.
Who wants to go first? Thomas?
Well, I'll say something, because I've actually thought about this. I think that there were a lot of similarities between COVID and climate change, and ones that I was very depressed about, because I was hoping this is a collective problem and we'll come together to address it, and instead we saw each country kind of acting for itself and not really extending benefits to other countries in many ways. Certainly in the US, and I know it may have been the worst, but it wasn't the only place. You had polarization, so people became much more invested in winning over the other party than in actually promoting public health. There was a great deal of science denialism. So I don't think it speaks well, particularly well, for how we're going to respond to climate change. But I do think there were some positive things, and one of those is, in fact, I think there's much more awareness of mental health as an issue, and the fact that public policies can affect mental health, and that it's not an individual weakness, but a response to events in many cases that can impair mental health. So I think we've learned some things, and I hope we can use those things in addressing climate change.
Thank you. Thomas?
Yeah, two things, and one of them is, of course, the rapid sort of acceleration of a form of innovation, which I think is really important in terms of vaccinations, thinking about how you can kind of transfer that thinking to climate change and energy transitions more broadly. But the other one, I think, is more troubling, which is a kind of not necessarily a lesson, but almost like a warning. So we had the acceleration of innovation, and on the other hand, the outsourcing of responsibility to individuals. Stay at home, and we didn't really see it addressed as a systemic challenge.
And it was a short-term
thing, not addressed as a systemic challenge. We've had discussions in Norway. What about the healthcare system? These kinds of things, which are probably the kinds of discussions we also need for climate change. So what are the systemic things we need to change to get policy and people and politics moving in that direction?
Thank you. But also there's one huge difference, and that is the climate change up until now, relatively recently, have been evolving quite slowly. Whereas the pandemic was pretty quick, and it spread out in a huge at large speed.
I think one important similarity is that we should trust science, and we should trust the institutions we have in society, which has the role to implement good knowledge-based policies. That's I think is a very important similarity between COVID and climate change. That we should and that we can trust. We should, and my experience also is from the COVID epidemic is that pandemic is that we also did. We trusted. We were trusting science, and we were listening to our leaders. When the city, we did. When the city mayor of Oslo told us to stay at home or to not go to a restaurant and to keep away from each other, even when we were walking in the park, we did so.
I'm laughing because it wasn't true everywhere.
No, here it was.
but then again, of course, if you close things down, if businesses are out, then you don't have the option of going out either, necessarily. But I know that you wanted to have a comment, Thomas, but I was interested, Susan, psychologically, because, and this is interesting for the pandemic, and I don't know if it applies to climate change. But I guess that we will see after, we've gotten rid of the virus once and for all, will you see that there are changes in people's, how should I put it, how we're actually dealing with each other? Because I remember going through different phases. At the beginning, I didn't really believe in this virus, and then I got a bit scared, and I saw that people, were sort of keeping their distance, and sometimes I got provoked, like, do you think I'm infectious? I'm not. All these different types of feelings that were coming, and slowly we are getting used to taking off our masks, but still some people are afraid to get that infection. There are so many things going on mentally, I guess, in a situation like that. How can we sort of use that to the benefit of the transition?
I think absolutely we can use it. I think the pandemic really opened up people's minds to possibilities. It was hard before this for people to imagine that their lives could change so much so quickly. And now we all know, yes, things can change incredibly dramatically, incredibly quickly. So I think that puts people in a position of receptivity to other changes. I think people did think a lot about doing things differently, and might make some changes more permanent. For example, just to take one example, increased working from home. But I think it's also very easy for people to fall back into previous habits, so there needs to be support. There's a moment for transition, but then there needs to be support for the continued transition.
Thomas, your short comment.
Yeah, I was just coming to trust science, and I sort of agree. But on the other hand, one of the really interesting things about COVID was that it showed us that the public can actually handle serious debates within science. And you got, public health officials and researchers discussing publicly the assumptions of their models, and if we do that, and if we do this, and fiercely discussing this publicly. We ended up kind of trusting what the governments proposed, but on the other hand, I think climate science can probably learn from this also, that we're perfectly capable of handling discussions about assumptions and about, ups and downs and these kinds of things.
But talking of insecurities is always a risk, I suppose. Now, I see that there are two more people at the front row wanting to ask some questions. And Anders Bjartnes, you were first. You're a professor at NTNU within industrial ecology. What is your challenge to the panel?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Well, having had the opportunity to communicate a lot about climate change mitigation, I've met some challenges, and I want to expose the panel to some of those. We're talking about accelerating the transition. We're talking about reaching net zero. And we're talking about trusting in science. And in the interface of that, when we portray the amount we actually have to reduce with emissions. Sort of, if you look at reaching 2 degrees, means that we need to go down almost as fast as, or about as fast as when we have come up with emissions. And if you're going to reach 1.5, we need to go even steeper down than what the emissions have been coming up. And yes, we embrace accelerating, but when you show those type of information, which is what science tells us we have to do if we're going to reach those low warming levels, that appears as such a daunting task to many policymakers, industry, and also general public, that the acceleration that we will be needing sort of becomes scary. So I wonder if you guys have some advice and how we might communicate how to actually approach that level of acceleration that we actually are needing without scaring those that need to undertake it off. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
We haven't understood the scope and the scale of this. We'll get a new message now from the IPCC next week, telling us what we have to do to reduce emission fast enough, and the number of solar panels and wind turbines and electric cars that we have to install. You're right, it's daunting. But then, what should we do when we're discussing this? We should also discuss, I think, how do we handle this transition so we make our society much more resource productive. If we have had a little bit of this discussion about hydrogen, for example, we should avoid hydrogen if we can. It's extremely resource intensive to produce hydrogen. If we can solve a problem without, it's much better. So that's the kind of discussion when we were talking about the COVID pandemic and how we should address these real challenges, to have an open discussion about the real difficulties and the scope, I think will be helpful.
We're getting there. Ed, I think you were raising your hand, weren't you?
Only psychically. Yeah. So whenever a challenge seems daunting to us, we tend to shy away from it. So it is incredibly important that we find ways to shrink the size of that challenge, to make it seem more approachable, to show people and communities. I think it's particularly important to show collectives, we as opposed to I, ways in which we can engage that will make a difference. And one of the reasons why I work with health professionals is because health professionals, there are many reasons to accelerate the decarbonization transition. One of those is health benefits. Immediate health benefits from decarbonizing the sources of energy in a given community. So right away, that takes a global problem and a global challenge to limit, for example, to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees, and every 0.1 degree above that is really worth fighting for, but that's an overwhelming challenge. Conversely, the challenge of decarbonizing my community here in Fairfax, Virginia, it's a challenge that is easier for me and members of my community to wrap our heads around. It's at a scale at which we live, and it's at a scale at which we can imagine what it will take to accelerate the decarbonization transition here in Fairfax. So I find that sort of the human psychology of the technological challenges that we face, that to use human psychology well, we have to shrink the change to a scale that doesn't terrify us and that allows us to engage rather than encourages us to put our heads in the sand.
Do you agree, dear psychologist of the panel, Susan?
Yes, absolutely. And I would say two more things. One is giving people examples of positive changes. I think we don't read enough of the stories about the new technologies or the new behavioral approaches that are really promising. And for people who think there's nothing to be done, well, why bother? It's actually an excuse to not do anything difficult because you think it won't make any difference anyway. Another effective communication strategy can be to encourage people to think about the future, and especially their children or their grandchildren, because we don't think that much about the future, but we care about our children. And for a lot of people, when they start thinking about the future for their children, it becomes much more meaningful to think about trying to make that a better future.
There's a question from the audience whether more radical proposals or attitudes to sustainable change potentially could lead to more polarization and slower change. You know, the counter-effective measure.
One more. Repeat, please.
Is it so that more radical proposals, you know, in changing towards sustainability could potentially lead to more polarization and a slower rate of change?
Difficult question to answer, I think. If you look at, for example, countries or regions that have an economy very much based on fossil fuel industries, of course you can trigger resistance if you approach this as if they were going to lose their jobs tomorrow, all of them, working in the fossil fuel industry. That's of course could be relevant.
I think I'm going to give the word to Christian Klöckner. So we're going to have another psychological perspective here, I guess.
Yes, I would like to draw the attention to something that has been mentioned before, and that is trust. And I don't think that the pandemic is a good example for climate change. We discussed it a bit in the beginning, but I don't think it's a good vision for how we handle climate change. But what we can learn from the pandemic is that the countries that came best through the pandemic are the countries where you have a high level of systemic trust. And I'm tempted to say that the resource that Norway has that is worth the most is actually the level of trust. It's much more important and valuable than oil, and it's much more important than fish and water power, because it enables Norwegian society to deal with such challenges. So my question to the panel would be, how do we fight the erosion of trust that is going on all around us, and also, of course, prevent it from happening in Norway, and how can we build trust in institutions again?
Yeah, that's a rather easy question. Who feels inclined? And I could actually add to it, because it's a parallel question from the audience, which is aimed at Edward, but I guess more of you would like to respond to it. Lifting trusted voices is important, but how can we deal with the many voices that we should not trust in the seemingly increasingly polarized discourse? Yeah, I know everyone wants to reply to that. Okay. Anders, first.
It could be that the situation we are living in just in these weeks is helping us. If we look at the threat from Putin and how the European or the democratic West has come together over the last weeks. How the European Union has reacted, how NATO has reacted, how the links between Europe and Biden's America has been enforced. It could help in the sense that we know that we have to protect democracy, we have to do it together, we have to elect and trust political leaders that can take a good role in very difficult circumstances. I have a kind of hope that this will bring us more together and help these institutions that we rely on to be stronger than we have seen over the last years. Brexit would never happen now.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
It's easier to erode trust than to get it back, I think. But one positive step would be increased transparency and increased listening and increased inclusivity. I think a lot of, taking the US as a case study, people felt that they were excluded from the mainstream discourse and they were excluded from governmental policies. So they fought back and they created a very oppositional identity. And in other countries as well, groups that feel that they're not listened to, they're not considered in public policies, don't trust the government to have their best interests in mind. So I think more listening panels that try to reach out to members of different communities and ask them about their concerns and their positions, that would be a start.
Yeah. Two types of answers. The first one is that, okay, this transition, I think, is a great opportunity to do that. Not by talking about industrial adventures and innovation and the kind of huge leaps forward, but by coupling that stuff to the everyday stuff going on the ground, building sort of the foundational economy of local communities, boring but important stuff, schools, hospitals, all this very basic stuff that communities and societies needs to function. And if we can link that stuff to the stuff of the transition, then I think we've come a long way. But to add to, because you added a thing, the untrusted voices, and it's interesting in this setting because it's framed, populism here, and I'm curious about where the populism is, and so I'm tempted to say that a lot of the populism in this debate, for instance, is by someone like our oil and gas minister this morning, who talked about keeping Norwegian oil alive and these kinds of things, which is also a form of populism.
Okay.
Just to throw that out there.
Ed.
So can I respond as well?
Yes, go ahead.
Excellent, thank you. So Christian's point about social capital, he called it collective trust being our most important resource. That is so, the social science bears that out very clearly. Social capital really is our most important resource. And Susan's point about once lost, hard to regain is also very true. I would suggest that we have an important human resource in every society in the world that can be harnessed to help us rebuild that trust, that social capital. And those people are called conflict mediators. They understand how, in societies where high conflict has come to rule the day, high conflict being defined as we no longer really remember what we're fighting about. We just remember how much we hate the other side. You really need to bring in professionals, conflict mediators, to help get to the source of what was the disagreement about in the first place, and can we please begin to work it through at that level. And I've had the privilege of working with the former dean of our School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at my university in helping to to take the conflict out of the broadcast meteorology community here in America. And trust me, this was a community 10 years ago that was just as hostile with there was as much polarization in that community 10 years ago as there was in the broader American community. And by working with a conflict mediator, we really got to the heart of the issues, and the conflict melted away at a rate that none of us could have anticipated. But it was really for me, it was quite an object lesson in how important conflict mediation really is and can be in helping us work through these polarization problems.
We have to, we're closing in now, and I would like for you to give us a final reflection on something that I asked the first panel this morning with Jean-Paul Adam from the UN, Rector Anborg at the NTNU, and also Elisabeth Karlheim from Equinor, which was how to ensure a just transition for all and leaving no one behind. And I could add, for at least 3 of you, or no, actually all 4 of you can have a reflection as to the social scientists could contribute to making change happen more rapidly towards sustainable societies in this, and at the same time making sure it's a just transition. So if you would like to reflect on that, I don't know, Ed, if you would like to start, or if you feel that what you just said is partly an answer to that.
Two responses. One is that our polling shows that I mostly poll in America, so bear with me on that. But our polling here in the U.S. shows that people really value the idea of doing the right thing, a just transition. Especially with regard to both those communities who have been most harmed by the fossil fuel economy, as well as the communities who have most enabled the fossil fuel economy that got us to where we are today. So Americans are broadly supportive of this idea of not leaving anyone behind. But I want to end with a piece of research that I think Susan actually was involved in. It was published a couple of years back in Nature Climate Change. A team of 24 psychologists from 24 different nations did a nearly global poll, and they asked what I thought was a brilliant question. They said, if your country takes the actions that are necessary to deal with global warming, tell us what your country will be like in the year 2050. And one of the themes that came out in the answer to that question is our country will be a more compassionate, fairer, kinder place. And I think that's a remarkable insight in in the fact that, broadly speaking, we understand that this is something that we need to do and will actually be good for us to take these actions. We won't leave sectors of our population, segments of our population behind. Doing this will bring out the best in us. And I think we haven't done nearly enough to take advantage of that deeply endearing part of human nature. Thank you.
Susan?
Sure. Well, thanks, Ed. I actually was not involved in that research, although I remember citing it in a paper, so I think it was a really interesting result. I do think that idea of inclusivity, and most people, with some exceptions, we may not be deliberately exclusive, but we may forget to try to consider other people's perspectives. I think we really, especially when making important decisions about transitions into a new energy system, a new economy, a new future, need to think about how different groups of people might be affected. So not just the people who are like us, but the people who are not like us, the people who have maybe some physical disability, or the people who have cultural ties to the land, or the people who are differently situated economically. How are they going to be affected by this transition point? And that's the way we can do it more in a more just and fair and inclusive way.
Thank you very much. Thomas?
Yeah, a lot of good points. So yeah, I'm not usually in the business of kind of throwing around the names of Nobel laureates, but I'll make an exception. And some years ago, there was Elinor Ostrom got the Nobel Award in economics, and one of the things that she sort of found through her research was that collective action on research management is natural resource management is both possible and it happens all around all the time. But another point was that it's incredibly diverse, so it's you know, it's not the same everywhere. And I think this kind of speaks to the points of the previous speakers here, that we really need to and can contribute as social scientists to understanding what's happening and going on locally, bring that into decision making. It might actually slow things down on the short term, but avoid sort of total collapse on the long term. So there's kind of two thoughts in the head there at the same time.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And Anders?
Yeah, just social scientists should participate more in the broad public debate. That would help us who is living that or working in that space all the time, and it would help politicians, decision makers in business and politics to make better decisions. So make your voices heard.
Well, thank you very much for all your reflections and the participation in the panel today. We are nearing the end of this conference, so I would like to say once again thank you to Ed and Anders, Susan and Thomas, and give them a big round of applause.